We have 4 presentations today, all from students in communication who are presenting their senior honors theses. So welcome to all of you, and thank you all. We have a great audience. Our first presenter is Vinnie Caroselli, and he will be talking about his thesis titled Addressing Intercultural Complexities Through Ethical Design Practices. So Vinnie, it's all yours. And please keep yourself muted until Vinnie's done speaking, everyone else. Thanks.
All right, well, hello everyone. Thanks for showing up to hear myself and everyone else talk about their senior research projects. As Dr. Cockett mentioned, mine is titled Addressing Intercultural Complexities Through Ethical Design Practices. So graphic design is a medium of communication that is just about as old as our opposable thumbs, with its impact and capabilities to inform and inspire greater now more than ever. Due to advancements in technology, artists can now carry the power of a computer in the palm of their hands. This change in technology and design capabilities is what keeps the profession fresh and ever growing. But it also requires design professionals to be adaptive and informed about the cultural impacts of these technological advancements. As the capabilities of the profession grow, so do the potential audiences for these pieces. There is now an increased ability to work seamlessly across geographical boundaries. And with that rise in potentiality, the designer's cultural knowledge must also increase. The necessity of increased cultural awareness in graphic design is the foundation for this thesis research and brings about my interest in intercultural design competence. This change in the profession is what inspired the following research question. How can intercultural design competence increase the visual appeal of a design while also addressing our interconnectivity of our increasingly global and diverse world? This thesis takes a multidisciplinary approach by combining the integrated media arts and communication department in order to work through the 4 steps listed here. Today, we'll first walk through the structure that supports why my research exists. Next, we'll discuss the methodology used. Then we'll do a simplified overview of the analysis, leading up to the discussion, or rather the so what of this research. First up is the theoretical framework. In order to answer my research question, I've gathered influence from 2 specific texts. The first one being The Everyday Language of White Racism, written by Jane Hill. This book explores the pervasive cultural system of white racism. It analyzes everyday talk and text to show how language that may purport itself as anti-racist is actually framed entirely by covert racist discourses, slurs, and other racially perpetuating tactics. 4 main themes gathered from Hill's text are covert racist discourse, a form of discourse that people do not understand as racist, but that equally reproduces stereotypes of people of color. Examples of how to spot this is by the use of the phrase, "I'm not a racist," but the next one is mock language. Mock language has multiple functions. It constructs a light, jocular, and humorous stance. I found the use of mock language to be a commonly used tactic throughout my analysis. And I assume people see it as a way to push the boundaries of advertising, and they seek to be more edgy and provocative in order to increase their audience engagement. The third theme is linguistic appropriation. When this is happening, words are commodified and become property. Their meanings and uses are now determined by their new owners. And finally, the last theme from Hill's text is social alexithymia. This can be best explained by the statement, "I'm not a racist because racists are bad and marginal people. Therefore, if you understood my words as racist, you must be mistaken. And if what I said came across as racist, you insulted me and lack a sense of humor and are oversensitive." The next text that I gained a lot of inspiration from is the Designer's Research Manual. This text provides the means for the connection between communication theory and design practices. The O'Grady's argue that now more than ever, businesses recognize the key to their financial success is great research-driven design. Designers need to learn to veer from the specificity of user-centered focus, avoiding audience segmentation, and the intent on creating artifacts for everyone. The theme that I pulled from this text is ethnographic research. This type of research helps designers understand what it may be like to be a member of the project's target audience. This is important because it allows a designer to immerse themselves into another potential perspective and imagine how the audience will interact and react to that piece. I developed 5 questions to use as the foundation for my analysis section of the thesis, but for the purposes of the presentation, I will only be going over the ones that are in dark blue. The first one is, to what degree does this advertisement use covert racist discourse to reproduce stereotypes of another culture? The second one I'll be going over today is, to what degree does this advertisement use white linguistic appropriation? And finally, to what degree does this advertisement show a lack of ethnographic research, and what are the effects of this? Now on to the methodology. I decided to use textual analysis for my research. This form of analysis is useful for researchers working in cultural studies, media studies, mass communication, sociology, and philosophy. Using textual analysis for the research allows me to study the potential impacts of food and beverage advertising on different cultures in hopes of highlighting the limitations of our own sense-making processes. Designers may understand their own and other cultures better. Although I am analyzing food and beverage ads, which are mostly visuals, the word text still applies. According to McKee, text is anything that we interpret into meaning. In this case, the food and beverage ads that I'm analyzing include pictures, text, geometric shapes, and other design elements. Yet all of these elements in the advertisement are placed there intentionally to ignite some sort of meaning-making process in the viewer. From the questions that I showed you before, I developed this checklist, which will allow me to analyze the amounts of each classification on the left used on a scale from none to explicit. Now on to the analysis. For the purposes of this presentation, I will only be analyzing 1 out of the 3 advertisements that I did analyze in my thesis. And for this, I chose this McDonald's dinner timing ad from the 1970s. As you can see from this chart, I deemed that the first 4 categories have explicit use, but the last one only has minor use. From this checklist, I will go into detail for my reasoning for 3 of these classifications. The first one up is this advertisement's use of mock language. As mentioned before, mock language aims to construct a light, jocular, and humorous stance. And although this ad tries to do so with the imagery of a happy family enjoying dinner at McDonald's, the lighthearted sentiment falls short due to the locating of African-American vernacular, as seen in the red, as un-American. Creating this advertisement for this specific demographic using this specific vernacular separates the African-American audience from the togetherness that McDonald's wants to convey with this ad. The next is this ad's use of linguistic appropriation. McDonald's has adopted and commodified African-American vernacular, specifically the use of G-dropping for the purposes of this ad. Jane Hill mentions in her book that African-American English has historically been used as an endless source of new materials for white mainstream American English users to sound cool, edgy, and high valued in popular culture. This ad fails to do that and only presents itself as tone deaf due to the lack of familiarity the white dominated advertisers have with the Black community. And finally, the ad's lack of ethnographic research. As I mentioned, this ad lacks only minor use of ethnographic research, and I said this because I presume some had to have been done in order for McDonald's to create an ad using this type of vernacular. The issue with the type of ethnographic research that is done is that it has been done improperly, leading to a piece only inspired by stereotypes. Rather than seeking an understanding on what it would be like to be a member of this family, this ad embraces the naivety that McDonald's has. Next, we'll move on to the discussion. I'd like to first point out 3 takeaways that this research does not aim to support. The first one is that this is not a holistic view of all food and beverage ads. The second one is that there is no intentions to call out creative teams as racist. And the third one is that this is not an attempt to persuade people not to purchase these items. What this research does show is the persistent, invisible, and normalized racist discourse embedded in popular advertising throughout and beyond the past 46 years. From my research, I've created a design with cultural competence icon with the hopes that creatives everywhere can take a pledge to adopt these practices. I hope to create stickers and window clings to make available to those who want them in efforts to normalize intercultural design competence and help the profession grow for the better. I've also created a design manifesto inspired by the 5 questions that I mentioned before. This is a declaration of the practices I hope design professionals will adopt and present to others, whether it be in their own home or their creative offices. As a creative, I am constantly brainstorming ways to further my capabilities and boundaries of design. I understand that in order to make progress and ignite innovation in the field, boundaries need to be pushed and risk need to be taken. I'm not against the idea of being edgy and taking risk with design, but because our culture has become much more understanding of the everyday use of racist discourse, designers must tackle projects with more than just a grain of salt. By showing that you conducted proper ethnographic research and are culturally aware of the impacts a piece may have, I believe that the audience will attract more towards that design than a design that lacks it. People matter in the design process, and by shifting the orbit of design towards practicing intercultural design competence, it can foster meaningful connections with the individuals it is targeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinnie. Does anybody have questions for Vinnie? We were going to use the raise hand function, but I don't think it's working. So if you have a question. Ryan, do you have a question?
Yes, I was trying to give a thumbs up. I don't know, raise hand, thumbs up. So Vinnie, my main question for you is, as a designer myself, there are so many things that happen in the world of design. And I'm wondering, how were you able to identify this as the one thing that you were on and make your research, right? So how did you identify this as your topic?
Like identify intercultural design competence?
Yes.
Well, first, in classes that I've had with you, we were able to like identify like an artist statement and things like that. And so throughout like my design practices and projects that I've been a part of, I've found a passion for designing and creating something for the betterment of a community and for others. And so being able to take something that I have passion in the design field as a social designer, along with something that I've learned to become passionate about in intercultural communication classes, I thought it was just a great way to combine those two into one and bridge 2 fields that may seem separate, but to show how they're really related, and taking the communication theory into the design world to hopefully progress the profession.
I just have to say, awesome work. And I agree with some of the comments coming in. It's awesome to see something that's usable by designers, and not just something that you can talk about, but something that we can put to use. So great work.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question for Vinnie.
I guess I've got a question for you. And thank you so much, Vinnie. My name's Elliot. I work in the ESL program working with international students, and that's what makes your presentation so interesting, because I'm working with students from all over the world and thinking, wow, this is so important in the field. I guess one of the challenges that I had is when I'm looking at the McDonald's image that you showed, which you analyzed really well, I'm struck at how do I attribute or who do I attribute that to? Is it about the community at the time, that community was more prejudiced oriented? Is it like a lack of development in the advertising companies? Or is it like the individual that created that poster or the small group of people that did that? Where do you reach out with what you're doing?
Vinnie, you
I
have
think
30 seconds to answer him.
okay. I think it's not one specific group. I think, as I mentioned a lot throughout my thesis, that this racist discourse has been so embedded and normalized within our society that it takes everyone's effort and everyone's participation in deconstructing the project of like white racist discourse into like our everyday language, and not like pointing out one specific person or one specific team, but maybe realizing that like you may be a part of the issue, that these things are just so normalized, and just shifting our practices as a holistic representation of everyone in the population, not just a specific group or team of people.
All right, thanks, Vinnie, and thanks, Elliot and Ryan, for your questions. We're gonna get Vinnie's screen unshared and Alex's shared, and we're gonna have Alex Jones do his presentation about his research called Redefining the Purpose of the Corporation. Alex, you're up.
All right, I am sharing. All right. So good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Jones, and I'm going to walk you through my senior thesis research project, which investigates the discourse surrounding the purpose of the corporation and how that's changed in recent history. So to kick off this conversation, I'd like to pose the question: when you think of corporations, what do you envision? Maybe you're picturing a bunch of people professionally clad, looking at a bunch of graphs, thinking about Excel spreadsheets and business terminology like stocks, bonds, and golden parachutes, whatever might be popping into your mind. If you don't have a lot of experience with corporations, your view of corporations is very likely informed by discourse, which philosopher Michel Foucault defines as historically contingent social systems that produce knowledge and meaning for us to interpret our world with. So whenever I reference discourse when I talk through this presentation, I'm talking about that implicit societal definition of an abstract subject. And basically, I pose this question because the discourse surrounding what the purpose of the corporation is in our society has changed a lot in recent years. So this study reveals the trajectory of a major discursive shift surrounding the purpose of the corporation from stakeholder primacy towards a vision of socially responsible stakeholder capitalism. So that's a loaded statement. So to unpack that, we're going to walk through what the fundamental arguments for the purpose of the corporation are, the research structure and method I used in this study, as well as implications for real-world corporate governance moving forward. So first thing, what is the purpose of the corporation? Hegemonically, what the dominant business practice is this idea of maximizing shareholder value. This is a concept that arose in the 70s, and basically what it suggests is that operational excellence and business success are hallmarked by competitive share prices and returns on investments, healthy returns on investments, and that as a means to find purpose and as a means to guide the operations of a corporation, if you maximize the value that you produce to shareholders, those that invest in your operations, you are fulfilling your responsibility. It's also known as principal agent theory in the legal sense of that. But at the same time, there's this idea of corporate social responsibility, which represents a strategic orientation that seeks to mitigate risks and maximize on opportunities that create value for multiple stakeholder groups. So that is inclusive of shareholders, but not stopping at shareholders. We've also got customers, suppliers, employees, the environment, communities, and the product of theories in corporate social responsibility over time is this picture of stakeholder capitalism. So that is basically a commitment that corporations make where they are balancing the needs and interests of multiple stakeholder groups and recognizing their importance to their decision-making throughout their value chain. These concepts have entered the frame of public discussion again because of the Business Roundtable. The Business Roundtable is a US-based organization, a coalition of 181 CEOs from the most influential organizations in the United States. And recently, they've developed this purpose on the statement on the purpose of the corporation, which basically outlines stakeholder capitalism as the paramount purpose that organizations should serve. And that's pretty funny because in 1997, they had a similar statement that outlined maximization of shareholder value as the most important corporate purpose, the overriding corporate purpose. So basically, this study is digging into why that in 22 years, the Business Roundtable has changed their idea of corporate purpose in society. So these concepts and statements informed my research structure and method, which operated on a two-tier analytic process. So the first step was tracing the development of the discourse surrounding corporate social responsibility in the modern era. And by modern era, I mean post-World War II. So starting in the 50s, tracing the development of this idea and its actionability to present day. And yeah, there's basically a lot of academic works and historical events that put this idea of corporate behavior and corporate purpose and what does business owe society, what does society owe business, into discussion and public discourse. The second part of this analysis was a rhetorical analysis of both of the Business Roundtable statements. So basically, throughout the study, I reference the two statements as discursive artifacts. That means to suggest that each statement represents the discourse on the purpose of the corporation at the given time that it was published. So the 1997 statement represents the discourse to 1997, and the same deal goes for 2019. And the rhetorical mechanism used to analyze these statements was the Bitzer framework for analyzing the rhetorical situation. So basically, Bitzer asks us to look at three dimensions of rhetoric. The first is exigence. So that is the problem to which these statements are responding to. In this case, corporate governance and corporate purpose, but of course, different influences and stuff. Second is audience, and not just anyone who can look at it and read it, but rather audience that can mediate the change that the statements wish to inspire. And then the third are constraints, which are basically influences that shape the message, limitations and opportunities that affect its presentation and delivery. So that was the research structure and method, which garnered insight into the discursive shift on two levels, which has material implications for corporate governance if this is to be the reality moving forward. So, two major implications that I'd like to discuss. The first is this tension between short and long-term strategic orientations in corporate governance. So, short-term practices over time are damaging to the health of the firm. When you think of things like stock buybacks and all of the basically the lack of innovation and investment into employees over time that the maximization of shareholder value sometimes encourages in decision making, you can see that these factors would influence corporation health over a long period of time, whereas long-term oriented organizations that take to heart this idea of balancing stakeholder interests and corporate social responsibility outperform short-term oriented corporations in overall value creation over time. That means to say that over a long period of time, sustainability focused organizations are creating more value for even just shareholders over a period of time. And shareholders have rights to fair returns, but focusing on quarterly earnings as your only motivation is shown to be really damaging over a long period of time. The second major implication here is defining a CSR framework that is actionable across industries. So corporate social responsibility is a voluntary concept in the United States, which means it's pretty ambiguous in practice. You know, is it a volunteer program or is it a comprehensive integration of environmental and social considerations to the value chain? We need to also recognize that different value chains, different industries have different capacities for creating value for different stakeholders. So that means to say, we need to, if we plan to move forward with this idea of socially responsible stakeholder capitalism, we really have to grapple with what is CSR across different industries. What is CSR in the food and beverage industry? What is CSR in the textile industry? What is CSR in a financial institution? And those considerations will shape how we actionalize CSR moving forward. Now, when you think of a corporation, what do you envision? I posed that question early in the presentation to prove the point that answers to that question are way different right now than they were 20 years ago. It's not just stocks and bonds and golden parachutes, but it's grown to mean something much more, something more concerned with society, inclusive of financial things, but the kind of the whole shebang of society. Today, we reviewed the fundamental arguments for the purpose of the corporation, the research structure and method used in this study, as well as real-world implications for corporate governance moving forward if this is to be the norm in business praxis. And I'd like to leave you with two conclusions. The business world is at the precipice of transformation. I do believe this, and I think that this two-tier analytic process showed that we're moving in a certain direction, and it's a certain direction that I think is significantly influenced by the outbreak of COVID-19 at this time. We're seeing corporations kind of step up and rekindle that connection with society and engage that societal response in unique ways. And a key consideration for this is that stakeholder capitalism relies on stakeholder engagement. That means to say that customers should be aware of the business practices that they support with their purchases. Suppliers need to step up with increased transparency, especially in human rights and environmental protection, which are fields where they're heavily criticized for. Investors should also integrate environmental and social considerations into their investment decision-making. Every stakeholder group has a responsibility to take action to support a stakeholder-oriented approach to corporate governance and effectively redefine the purpose of the corporation.
Thank you, Alex. So I have questions for Alex, but because I'm his advisor, I'm going to defer to the people in the audience and see how many of you guys have some questions for him.
I have a question. This is Allie Golden.
Hello, Allie Golden.
Hi. My question is, what was the most difficult part of your research and what was the most rewarding part of your research?
Okay. I think so I did a lot of history research, pretty comprehensive. It was like 25 pages or something of just like history on this concept. But I do really think that the analysis part was probably the most difficult, because in my time at Juniata, my communication curriculum has been focused largely on like communication philosophy and social science applications of communication. I have never been a rhetoric person, but I thought it was important to engage it on that level for the study. So I kind of had to learn it on the fly, and I think being able to do that and the insights that that garnered into what these statements themselves actually present and what they mean has been really rewarding.
Alex, this is Lauren Bowen. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, totally.
So I'm curious, we're going to use me as an example. So I heard you at the beginning say that my understanding of corporations is shaped by discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And so as somebody who engages in discourse to explain, let's say, the college as a corpus, maybe not as a corporation, I'm wondering what insight, based on all your analysis, you might have for how we shift our discourse or how we talk about corporations to maybe change the way in which I or anybody understands them.
Mm-hmm. And I think it does at the at the public level have to start with an understanding of CSR not as a department or a like something that is separate from everything that the corporation does, but rather viewing it as something that is a strategic piece that is rooting everything together. So I think that the conversation will start with corporations that are doing a good job in this regard, or with corporations that are doing a bad job. I think that throughout history, it's either been primo examples or corporate scandals that have brought this issue of corporate social responsibility into our talking about it. So I think that, thinking of this more as a big picture implication rather than a department as it's sometimes categorized is an important step forward in how we understand this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I use the word corpus rather than corporation specifically because I think, right, if we all understand ourselves as part of the organization, then we're more likely to exercise that responsibility than when it's seen as segmented. Yeah, because corporate has a pejorative term, and I understand why, and I invoke it that way myself sometimes. So your analysis is helpful. Thanks for sharing.
Of course, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alex. You did a great job. Next up, we're going to have Laura Stepnowski, who is going to present her senior thesis in communication on issues of marginalized genders in healthcare. I think you'll see as you listen to Lauren and then Kat Lanigan that communication as a field has, it's very broad. And so now we're going to shift gears pretty significantly and look at it from a very different perspective that I think you'll probably really enjoy. So Laura, the screen and the mic are yours.
All right, thank you, Lynn. Hang on. I get my presentation ready. Okay. Hello, my name is Laura Stepnowski, and I believe that health is one of the most important aspects of a person's life. Having poor health prevents us from feeling our best and getting the most out of life. Despite its importance, health is still an area where the quality of your healthcare depends on who you are. People often face differences in the quality of their healthcare on the basis of various socio-demographic factors. I'm interested particularly in the treatment of those of differing gender identities, which is why today I will be presenting my research on the ways in which people with marginalized gender identities experience healthcare. My guiding question throughout my research was, how is the doctor-patient relationship communicated to people with marginalized? So I'd like to break this down a little bit and go over some key terms. The doctor-patient relationship is something that has been widely studied in the field of healthcare, and it simply means the relationship between a patient and their doctor. I want to emphasize that I'm taking a patient-centered approach to my research. Since the patient is the one seeking healthcare, therefore their needs should be prioritized. And the term marginalized gender identities refers to anyone whose gender identity falls outside of the cisgender male norm. The goal of my research is to understand people's healthcare experiences on an individualized level. For this reason, I needed to focus more on a few individuals rather than an entire group of people. Quantitative research tries to make research as objective as possible and removes the context in which the data is found. In qualitative research, the context is crucial to the meaning of the data. So, in order to truly understand the unique ways of stories of people with marginalized gender identities in healthcare, I need to understand the ways in which they experience them. So it's better in this case to seek out those individual meanings through qualitative research. I took an intersectional research, which means that I understand and acknowledge that many factors influence someone's life experiences. Like I said before, various socio-demographic factors affect the way someone will be treated in healthcare. So while I'm only focusing on people with marginalized gender identities, I recognize that this is not the only factor that shapes a person's healthcare experience. Taking this viewpoint into account, I identified various bodies of research that had to do with the discrepancies in healthcare on the basis of gender. There's a long history of differences on the basis of gender, with the main focus on cisgender women's other gender identities have been marginalized to the point of erasure throughout history. These differences have been present since the early days of medicine. There have been many instances where doctors diagnose their female patients with hysteria or even with a restless uterus. We know today that there is no real scientific basis for these diagnoses, but back then they were considered just as valid as any other condition. This caused many real diagnoses of conditions that affect women to be rendered non-existent, and it explains why disorders like endometriosis have not been given a name until very recently in healthcare. This shows systematic disadvantages that women have been placed in, and it has even more severe implications for those whose gender identities have not been recognized until very recently. Over time, the differences physicians communicate to their patients still exist, but it has taken on a much subtler form, making the differences harder to detect. This is called unconscious bias. For example, a study on cardiac issues among men and women revealed that fewer women with coronary heart disease were found to be given appropriate medication, and women with atrial fibrillation have been treated with anticoagulants to a lower extent than men. The data collection method consisted of focus groups, where I would ask each group a series of questions related to their quality of healthcare. In total, I conducted 2 focus groups, each consisting of 3 participants. And since gender is the main focus of this study, I've listed each participant's gender identity on the slide. I recorded each of the focus groups I conducted so I could transcribe them in order to begin analyzing. Once I transcribed each focus group, I read over them to familiarize myself with the content. Then I began coding by reading each line of the assigned word to each line. I initially used the participant's own language, which is referred to as in vivo coding. I then used descriptive coding to group similar findings together and further analyze each data point I found. After analyzing my data that I retrieved from the focus groups, I learned a lot about the nature of communication surrounding healthcare. The two findings that I will be talking about today are that participants use more collaborative language when discussing their positive healthcare experiences, and they use more one-sided language when discussing their negative experiences. Specific language used by the participants in the focus groups, so I created frequency tables of the words and phrases they use to talk about their positive and negative healthcare experiences. When talking about their positive experiences, participants use more collaborative words to describe the nature of communication with their doctor. When I say collaborative, I mean that the words they use to describe how their doctor treated them imply a level of trust between them that allows the patient to speak openly about potentially uncomfortable experiences. Some of the words and phrases used most by participants include listen, conversation, and many of them show the importance of having a trusting relationship with their doctor, including listen and explain, and conversation as well. The other terms used to describe positive experiences are also listed on the slide, and these are terms that were only used once by a participant, but they're still relevant to my research. Opposite to their positive experiences, participants tended to use more one-sided language when discussing their negative healthcare experiences. This means that the language participants used tended to imply that their relationship with their doctor was not as trusting, and perhaps that their distant value experiences. Additionally, something interesting I noticed was that many participants talked about their negative experiences by talking about what their doctor didn't do, like in the words conversation and comfort. Again, I listed other words participants used once on the slide to the right. When comparing the language between both positive and negative experiences, I noticed that the participants generally tended to use language with a positive connotation more often than words with a negative or neutral connotation. One participant talked about his experience with one of his doctors, saying she was super supportive and she was like, oh, let's talk about what birth control options will be best for you. Language like supportive has a clear positive connotation, and the phrase talk about implies a back and forth between the patient and his doctor. The two-sided implication of this term has a positive connotation since it shows that a patient's doctor values their input as well, and this creates a level of trust between them. But when talking about negative experiences, participants either use neutral language or they use positive language in describing what their doctors failed to do during their appointments. For example, they use words like say and tell when talking about what their doctor did that made the experience negative. One talked about her negative experience with her doctor, saying, she just started telling me everything I'm doing wrong. Here, the word telling doesn't reveal much about the nature of the conversation, but it becomes clear why her experience was negative, since her doctor was telling her all the things she was doing wrong. After that, she said basically it wasn't a conversation. Conversation is a word with a positive connotation, as it implies that two-sided interaction between a patient and their doctor. However, this participant uses it in a negative way since her doctor failed to engage her in that conversation. The other examples I noticed as I analyzed the language used by the participants in focus groups I conducted. The main takeaway is that trust is a key factor in determining the quality of healthcare experience for people with marginalized gender identities. In order to demonstrate trust in their patients, doctors can engage in collaborative communication acts like listening and engaging their patients in a conversation that allows them to be heard. Additionally, it is important for a doctor to ask their patient questions related to their health, but to be done so in a welcoming and understanding way. One participant of my research spoke about what the nurse asked her when she was having chest pain. She asked the question, what do you mean by chest pain? When spoken out of context, this sounds like a question that any healthcare professional might ask in an appointment, but when the participant answers her question, she says, well, there's nothing wrong with you, you're not having a heart attack. Clearly, the nurse's tone creates a hostile environment for the patient, and this is why tone, especially when asking questions, is important to patient perception of healthcare experiences. So, my guiding question throughout my research was, how is the doctor-patient relationship with marginalized gender identities? I wanted to explore this topic because of the current discrepancies in healthcare on the basis of gender. And I found that participants' language when describing their experiences in healthcare differed depending on whether the experience was positive or negative. Participants used more collaborative language when describing their positive healthcare experiences, and they used more one-sided language when describing their negative experiences. These findings show that changes need to be made in order to reduce the negative experiences many people face in healthcare. Currently, much of the training in our system does not address the unconscious biases that affect patient perception and quality of care. One way our healthcare providers can change this is by being more empathetic with their patients. According to my research, empathy includes taking time, engaging the patient, valuing the patient, and clear communication. This is what I found in my research, and there are other studies that confirm what I'm arguing. My findings show that some of the most valued aspects of the patient's healthcare experience are trust, listening, and the ability to have a good relationship with their doctor. Healthcare providers can be aware of their own unconscious biases that cause them to treat patients differently over things the patient cannot control. By placing a heavier emphasis on empathy, doctors can provide their patients with better care. And by using these findings to influence the doctor-patient relationship, we can begin to look at the changes that need to be made in healthcare to minimize the number of negative experiences for everyone, regardless of their gender. Thank you, and I will be taking questions now.
Thank you so much, Laura. Does anybody have questions for Laura?
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
Did you, in your research, run into any political implications of the doctor-patient relationship? That is, when the government tries to control what the doctor can tell the patient. Did you run into that?
No, I did not. But that's a very interesting thing that needs to be talked about, and I think that would be an interesting direction for this research to take if I were to further pursue it. So thank you.
Yes.
Another question for Laura? Laura, I am wondering, and I wonder if maybe some other people in the audience are, how did you decide that everybody other than a cisgender male is marginalized?
So most of the research on the doctor-patient relationship or with healthcare is based on cisgender men. And I just feel that more gender identities need to be taken into account, and their needs are obviously different from a cisgender male as a transgender person's need different from a cisgender woman's, and so on. So I think that it's important to give a voice to those identities that are not as prevalent in the research that's currently available to us.
Thanks. Anybody else? One more question for Laura? And we can let Kat get started. All right, Laura, great job. Thank you so much. And we're going to let Kat get started sharing her screen. And Kat will be presenting on her senior thesis about, well, sex.
Alrighty. Oh. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. The most important part of this research is that it's heard, so I'm happy that we could have a virtual LAS and that you'll all be here to experience the words of these women. So I titled my thesis, Can I Talk About, Finishing? Female College Students' Sexual Empowerment and Identity Narratives. So I'm a senior strategic communication POE. My secondary emphasis is in women and gender studies, if you couldn't tell. And a special thanks to my masterful thesis committee, Dr. Cockett of the Comm Department, Jody Althouse, Juniata's director of the Office of Interpersonal Violence, and Dr. Bowen, our provost. So first things first, I want to unpack this title because many of you came here to hear about social design, responsibility, and now we're talking about sex narratives. So exploring this title might help to orient you a bit about what this research is and what the point is, why we're thinking about this. So there are three key things in this quote that are really the point of this research. First, I put this in the title because that's a quote from one of my participants. Since this is a narrative research project, it's driven by the words of its participants. In this case, I conducted interviews with female identifying students at Juniata. Second, this quote is from towards the end of one of my interviews, by the time I had gotten comfortable with my interviewee. It was a moment that deserved pause because both my interviewee and I were wondering why she felt like she had to ask that question. And indeed, many of my interviewees felt a strong sense of hesitation and awkwardness about approaching the topic of sex, even on a surface level. And lastly, the fact that the participant felt it was taboo to talk about finishing itself says a lot. You'll learn that many of my interviewees don't necessarily get physical pleasure out of sex. So with that new perspective, you're ready for it all. The question I was trying to answer with my project was, how are undergraduate women at Juniata experiencing sex and interpreting these experiences? But on a deeper level, what I was really trying to get at is, does an internalized sense of femininity play into how these women experience and interpret sex? Does femininity play into their identities and the way they experience everything, but most importantly, sex? So now let's talk about the theoretical and the academic background of this research. First, this research is grounded in the constitutive view of communication, that communication constructs our reality. As we experience concepts communicated to us, we construct ways of viewing the world and ourselves. As humans, we listen to things like media, government, parents, our church, and that communicates to us how we should act, how we should think. For example, it's notable, especially in this research, that the concept of gender is communicated to us. Whenever I fill out a form and it asks if I'm male or female only, that communicates to me that this space recognizes the gender binary. Okay, I'm female. But one of my professors never genders any students and refers to us all as they. So in that space, I recognize that the gender binary is non-existent and I stop thinking about it. And perhaps that's the key part there, that I stop thinking about it. I adjust my thinking and my sense of self based on the way someone else has communicated with me. So according to identity theorist Donald Carbaugh, our identity is a performance that must be adjusted on a particular social scene. So for that reason, performing identity is viewed as an awesome accomplishment that shows cultural competence and understanding of society, culture, the way to act appropriately. Good job, guys, if you have identity. So we have to think about this in the case of this research because my interviewees all chose to identify as women and act accordingly. Speaking of acting like a woman, the other piece of scholarship that informed this research is femininity theory. This is the theory that women construct their sense of gender and selves according to what communication? Patriarchal communication. Basically a powerful male-dominated sense of structure. So with this systematic study of women, and this is often adolescent women at that, but we can hope that these narratives will maybe fill some of the missing research for this age group. This body of research has found that what it really means to embody femininity is to do these two things. One, objectify your body, and two, exhibit a lack of authenticity in your relationships. Another way of thinking about this is, how does a woman construct her sense of self in relation to her body, and how does she construct her sense of self in relation to others? So this is really important, and I want to dive in a little deeper. The embodiment of femininity is actually a lack thereof. Researchers Tolman and DeBold found that girls learn to experience their bodies from an outside male perspective, a patriarchal perspective. And rather than experiencing their bodies, they watch them with an internalized male gaze. Disassociating with the body then leads to the loss of awareness of one's feelings and desires, and women feel they should constrain their bodies to move within ladylike norms, another patriarchal concept. In another study, it was found that girls dissatisfied with their body image were less likely to negotiate contraceptive use because they feared rejection from their partner. So maybe you can see I'm getting at that this has implications for the ways that women healthily navigate their selves and sex. So next, with the lack of authenticity, this was established in a 1992 study that found that as middle school girls began to reach adolescence, they also began to lose their ability to speak their true thoughts and feelings in an effort to avoid conflict and maintain relationships. Multiple studies found that the increased relationship authenticity is associated with increased sexual health, self-esteem, and mutuality in relationships, as well as decreased depression. So basically, being more authentic in relationships is healthier for women. So given that understanding, let's talk about how we're going to apply and examine these theories at a Juniata level. So first, as I said, through narrative. The narrative paradigm was developed by Walter Fisher in 1985, and he basically argues that humans are storytellers. So we look at our participants as social actors. Remember, identity is a performance. And their narratives reveal their situatedness in the world. In this case, that's as a woman, college student, etc. Other notable reasons for using narrative include, most importantly, since this research is grounded in feminism, letting participants of a marginalized, unheard group speak for themselves is an important point, especially on the topic of sex. I'd argue that there isn't much representation of women talking about sex in a genuinely human, comfortable way. Second, narrative allows participants themselves to articulate their intimate personal experiences. I really wanted the participants to be able to reflect on their experiences and learn from the interview. At the end of this project, I will send my participants their interviews so they can see how eloquently and deeply they could reflect on their sexual lives and maybe learn something from their past self. And finally, narrative gives a platform for unanticipated themes to arise from the data. I try not to assume anything of my participants' experiences. I had my N was 4, I had 4 interviews. Ideally this would have been more, but because of the pandemic that looked a little different, it was hard to ask women trying to complete their degree online to also deeply reflect with me about sex. So our interviews lasted 45 minutes, sometimes in person, sometimes over Zoom or over the phone. And I asked questions like, how do you feel about your body? How do you feel about yourself in relationships? Why do you have sex? Do you enjoy it? Do you feel present during it? So my second method was autoethnography, which is a methodology where the researcher examines themselves. The point of this is for the researcher to make themselves vulnerable to the public and their participants. If I'm asking my participants to reflect on these intimate topics, then I better do it myself too. So I've been asking myself the same things I asked my participants and recording those in my journal. Fundamentally, this research is about giving women the opportunity to reflect on this thing that I've found even their partners don't ask them about. And secondly, this research is amplifying women's voices and experiences of sex to be heard and listened to. So again, that makes this research this presentation the most important part of it. So I'm really thankful for everyone that's here and willing to listen to these stories. So next, my methods of analysis. So first I transcribed all the interviews line by line, typed out the words of my participants and myself. And then with my thesis advisor, Dr. Cockett, I went line by line and coded my interview. So every line of the interview has a code basically. So you'll see on the side here, some of the codes we're looking at are sex, gave up self, enjoyed, not happy, make others happy, sex is expected, obligation. So this was a really interesting area of code in one of my interviews, and maybe that just gives you a taste of what the interviews looked like and the type of words that the participants were bringing up and the themes that they were bringing up. And in conversation, the women's stories themselves are interesting, but what's equally as interesting is the line by line different codes we find. So then once some of my major themes that I found were personal growth, which was a great theme to find. It was empowering for myself to find and for my interviewees. Every woman had some kind of personal growth. They talked about the ways they used to experience sex and themselves and their femininity and the ways they experience it now and how that has shifted. They talked about a body journey in that and their self-worth increasing, their empowerment in sex and relationships increasing, realizing they don't owe anyone anything, and also an acceptance of desire and agency and the fact that they want to have sex and can have sex. And then finally, there were some themes of body objectification, though most women had moved past that. So let's go into that a little more. I want to pull out some quotes from my participants because that's really driving the research, as I said. So regarding body journey, one of my participants said, and so I do go back and forth. And I catch myself kind of having negative thoughts, but I just remind myself that as long as I feel good and feel strong and confident, then why does it matter if I don't have a six-pack? That has been a change as well, over my life. So this just shows that this has been a really fluid situation for the participants, accepting their body, accepting the way they move within it and act within sexual situations, and then just regular situations too. Personal growth in regards to self-worth. I felt like a lot of times I had to do things, and that's why I didn't feel empowered. And I felt like it was more about me proving myself instead of just doing it because it feels good. It's more reciprocal, it's more understanding. It's more just overall better. So that also allows me to then feel better during sex and feel more empowered and feel not judged or feel like I have to do anything. So that shows a lot of growth there with that participant. There's such a strong sense of obligation for so many of the participants. And as they grew in their sense of self and self-worth, that really shifted to being in control and having agency. Which moves us to our next point, acceptance of desire and agency. So a lot of women talked about how they come to terms with having sex and desiring it. One woman described when she talks with her friends about sex, but mostly like, I guess for the most part, it's just like funny stories, I guess, that are happening. And I'm like being okay with like, oh, that was really awkward. Like I need to go tell my friends and it's really funny, and just being okay. So a lot of women describe needing to be okay with sex, which is an interesting concept. But a lot of them have shown growth and gotten through it, especially with the help of communicating with their friends and peers about what this journey has been like, perhaps this unique experience as a woman experiencing sex. And body objectification. So a lot of women had themes of looking at their body from an outside perspective, as research showed. Yeah, I think I judge myself a lot, and I don't really like my body at all. I think I'm not accepting of it. I feel like the only time I think I appreciate my body and like my body is whenever someone else is telling me that, you know, I have a nice body. So this was an interesting quote because it exactly reflected the research that, you know, their patriarchal discourses are communicating to women what the value in their body is. And then some other interesting findings, not necessarily themes, but interesting things that women had brought up. The idea of consensual sex that's not quite consensual. So one woman described that whenever she had sex with her partner, it was always consensual, but she didn't necessarily want it. Sometimes she felt sad afterward. So this was interesting because, you know, it wouldn't exactly be consensual by consensual standards. So that leads us to a gray area. Definitely that should be explored more about what consensual sex means, who has power and agency, what the power structure is in relationships. And then finally, almost every woman brought up ideas about her mom. So I talked about, you know, the constitutive view of communication and things that are communicated to us about our identity. So it was interesting how many women brought up that their moms had communicated things to them about their femininity and about sex. So with my mom, it was more just like, you don't want to ruin yourself. I grew up with my mom always telling me, like, you should always wait for marriage. But if you don't want to have sex, you shouldn't get married to somebody just because you want to have sex with them, which I think gave me mixed signals, but I never really listened to my mom. Nice one. So that was just a really interesting finding to see how women were experiencing that, taking in discourses. Some women mentioned Christian values and church as a communication that came to them about sex. Also their friends, their sex education in school, etc. So future directions of this research, definitely a representation of more marginalized voices. All four of my interviewees were white, and I think that's notable. I think that people of color, women of color, experience sex differently and would have different intersections of identity that would make this research more holistic. I'd like to hear the male perspective on this and see if that shifts. And then finally, I'd like to hear from more participants. This research will continue over the summer. So if this resonated with you and if you're interested in on reflecting on your sex life and your identity, please reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. I probably don't have to invite people to ask questions. I bet we have quite a few. So if anybody has questions.
I have a question, Kat.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you're talking about like how you're socialized from a young age, specifically as a woman, of like how to feel about your body and how to feel about sex. How do you feel like pornography plays a role in that, especially because you have young males watching pornography, I feel like at a younger age than women, maybe because it's stigmatized, but how do you think pornography plays a role in how sex is kind of like shown to children at a young age, and then how that kind of ingrains itself into how people have sex when they get older?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Olivia, and I think it definitely plays into those powerful patriarchal discourses that communicate to us. And I think pornography is very patriarchal. So that has to have some kind of effect on women. I think perhaps it makes us view sex as, there's a large body of research on it. Perhaps it makes us view sex as more violent. Women have less agency. Women are kind of meek, maybe shouldn't be desiring it. Yeah, that's definitely something that should be explored. Some women brought up pornography and said that pornography had communicated to them about their sex, but not all of them. Thanks.
Thank you.
Our session is over in 1 minute, so if we can get in one last word, you are welcome to do it. Allie.
Yeah. Hi, Kat. Good job.
Hey, thanks.
My question is, So I remember when I was like applying to my master's programs and I was writing my personal statement, Dr. Worley told me that I was becoming like an activist scholar. So I'm wondering, would you want to use this in like an activist type lens? And if so, how would you approach that?
That's an awesome question. That's exactly the point, actually. The whole point of this research was to have an event where I got to share women's stories. That's why LIS was such an important part built into the research, because yeah, I think it's exactly activist research, sharing the narratives of women. You know, I'd like to, I use this in my Bailey speech, actually. I, you know, referenced the fact that I'd interviewed women and was getting these themes from them. So definitely, you know, with permission from my interviewees, I'd really like to be able to share this on as many fronts as possible. Thanks, Allie.
Thanks to everyone. Kat, you did a great job, and so did all of our participants today under some really trying circumstances. We're getting a round of applause from an emeritus professor, so that's pretty awesome. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.